One point that I should mention, however, is that in my undergraduate studies, I became interested in the question of what is knowledge, in part because I was taking classes with Chandra Mohanty and other women of color who are raising this question of how is knowledge constructed? How is knowledge a colonial construction? And through the process of doing that research, that was sort of the beginning of or one of the beginnings, many beginnings, of my own interest in Islam as an alternative way of knowing to Western colonial constructions, if you will, an alternative way of being. Okay, so the long story short, I became Muslim, and that question, however, remained paramount in my actual research and studies. This idea of how do you know in Islam? How do you know what you know? You know, the question of epistemology, the question of ontology. What does it mean to be? And I did my work at Berkeley, where I met Ramon, in education. And ironically enough, in education, the question of knowing is somehow peripheral. You would think that education, this would be the main place where we talk about the philosophy of education, but for some reason, philosophy of education is marginalized within schools of education. And now for the most part in the United States, they talk about the achievement gap or policy, but without raising fundamental questions about the premises on which all the policies are founded. Okay, so for me, the move that I attempted to make was one that would reconstruct or construct, if you will, for the first time, a philosophy of education, but from the standpoint of the Quran. So part of my work then deals with what is education from a non-Western point of view, or what is education from a specifically Islamic point of view. And in that sense, it's decolonial, although I do not use the decolonial theorists in some of my research. And what I was looking at was what are the methodologies of knowing that the Quran, either implicitly or explicitly presents. Okay, what are manifestations of knowing in the Quran? And for me, this was what I ended up doing. Essentially, was assembling the opinions of different scholars. And in particular, I was interested in this idea of the fusion of three major methodologies of knowing. Of course, there's the first one, wahi, is revelation, which of course is specific to the prophets, which is limited, which is not for everyone. But there's something there too that is the essential foundational element of the Quran, that it is wahi. If we look at the Quran and we center the Quran and talk about a Quranic epistemology, then we cannot deny that the Quran, at least from the Muslim point of view, at least from its status as scripture, is from a divine source. Okay, and of course, as Muslims, this is obvious. If you're coming from outside, we know Orientalism and the Orientalist tradition has spent many centuries attempting to refute that or show the materiality of the Quran strictly, the historicity of the Quran at the expense of its divine status. So at least in the very first instance, then it's necessary, I think, to establish that the Quran itself makes the claim of its divine origin. And again, that's obvious from the Muslim point of view. That's the foundation of our understanding. So anyway, three methodologies of knowing that I see is revelation. Second one is rationalism, but not necessarily the modernist rationalism or the Greek rationalism of nice ringtone there. The rationalism of in a Greek sense, right, or rationalism in an imposed sense. So we have to start understanding how does the Quran, or how would we define rationalism in the Quran? None of this I can do in 20 minutes, by the way. So I'm just giving you the vaguest, most rudimentary of outlines. So that's the second methodology I'm looking at, is rationalism. And the third one is mysticism. Okay? And even these three can be broken down further. But they're general epistemological modalities, if you will, of Quranic thought. Revelation, rationalism, and mysticism. So wahi, the aqliya, elements of the Quran, what is connected to the aql, the intellect, and ma'rifah, irfan, ma'rifah, and these dimensions, okay? So again, I should also say my premise is, I'm looking at insan, as Professor Barlas has been talking throughout the whole time. One of the foundation of my work is already on, it rests on the idea that there is insan, and it is not in that, and I'm not looking at it, I'm looking at it then from the point of view of ontological equality, okay? So that there isn't a difference here between men and women in terms of the nafs, the human being, okay? So a few things. The place that I found, and so this research is on one hand philosophical, it is also, I try to attempt to historicize it. And the place that I found these three modalities in interaction with each other in different ways was in the city of Qom, Iran, where I did my field work. I wouldn't call it field work. I would say, I'm not an anthropologist. I interviewed some people there. I visited there 4 times in Qom, Iran. And of course, you know that Qom is the seat of learning in the Shi'i Ithna Ashari tradition of Islam. Okay, so Qom is in some ways to the Shi'i Muslims as Al-Azhar is to the Ahl Sunnah. Okay, so there, of course, we have many centers of learning. And my work is actually called A City of Knowledge. And so I'm looking at Qom as a city of knowledge in the sense of being a constellation of madrasas, but not that only the madrasas, not that the madrasa is the sole site of learning, libraries, masajid, people's homes, public spaces, right? And so I'm trying to redefine in many ways, or at least make an intervention here where the madrasa or the pazantran has been presented as in a particular way. And I'm trying to say that in Qom we have a different definition that helps us to rethink the madrasa. And of course the Orientalist depiction and the current war on terror depiction of the madrasa is as a school of hate, where the Muslims study hate day and night, right? Early in the morning, starting off with hatred, moving on to intolerance, hostility, belligerence, and all the other interesting disciplines that we study in Islam, right? That we're inculcated with hate. But I'm only half joking. This is how it's been portrayed in the media, right? And so I wanted to see what does this look like on the ground, okay? So I chose Qom, Iran, in spite of the difficulties of access and the problems of doing research in Iran on that side as well as in the West in terms of responses to that. And I went ahead and looked at a number of scholars and how then that they interpreted verses in the Quran with which I've assembled and attempted to construct an Islamic philosophy of education, okay? So normally I just freestyle everything. Today I'll actually do a little bit of reading just because it'll be a bit faster. And so I'll just begin off and maybe interrupt myself. I have time, okay. It is self-evident that religious scripture...
No escape here.
What's that? No escape. I'm not trying to escape, man. I came here for this, okay. It is self-evident that religious scripture has an intrinsic educational purpose by default in transmitting sacred knowledge from its source, its divine source, to a general audience. So when we talk about Islamic education, then of course the mission of Islam then is fundamentally, intrinsically educational, okay? And it goes without saying. The Quran's open claim to universality and finality raises the question of how its educational approach might reflect these qualities. So the Quran then makes a claim that it is a universal text, right? It may have its specific location in the sense of revelation. It may have a language that is full of its own specificities. At the same time, the Quran itself makes a claim to universality, right? That it is for all people, for all times, from the time of its revelation to the present. Okay, and finality, that it is the final revelation. Okay, so there's no escaping this fact, or these two facts. Okay, so then how might this be reflected in its educational approach? In exploring the Quran's philosophy of education, I looked at two interrelated elements, methodologies of learning and of teaching. Okay, and of course these two are closely intertwined or inextricably linked. There are many other aspects of the Quran's educational philosophy, but I'm going to limit it to what we just talk about as transmission of knowledge. Okay, and I still feel like that is useful. In Western educational discourse, if you talk about the transmission of knowledge, you get in trouble because there's immediately this idea comes of, okay, here's the knowledge, and you're just passing it on, and there's no transformation going on. Okay, what Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educational theorist, would call banking. Okay, whereas I'm trying to show how that this is not what I mean by transmission of knowledge, but that transmission kind of, for me, even though it's more, we think of it more along the Orientalist terms, or an older way of thinking about maybe medieval education or medieval intellectual history of transmission of texts. Okay, so that the transmission involves often translation. It means interpretation. It means commentary. Okay, but it does also mean some fidelity to the original text. So one becomes a hafiz by memorizing the Quran and protecting the Quran, and in a sense, preserving it in one's memory, but also one's heart. Okay.